The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the third day of this 7-day session here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'd like to share something that is very, very important in terms of Zen practice and life itself, really. Pema Chodron's, one of Pema Chodron's very earliest books was titled The Wisdom of No Escape. The Wisdom of No Escape. And case number 43 in the Hekigan Roku, also known as the Blue Cliff Record or the Blue Rock Record, a collection of koans from quite a long time ago. Tungshang, also known as Tungshang Yangzhi, or in Japanese pronunciation of his characters, his Chinese characters, since the Chinese language, written language, was the first written language in Japan. He's known as Tokusan in Japanese. He was a formidable monk. There are 3 koans at least featuring him. And it shows the transition between a feisty, heady, early practitioner who had just had a kensho and it had gone to his head. He had what is known as the Zen sickness, where instead of dropping away our ego, and again, I don't like to use that word ego because an ego is important. His self-image, he gained a new one as a result of that kensho. And so he did some fairly wild things. He was free up to a point, and so he engaged in that freedom without any sensibility about it. But we'll leave that for another time. At any rate, at this point, he's an older teacher, and he lived during the Tang Dynasty, the very famous Tang Dynasty in terms of Zen practice in China. It's a long time ago, the 800s and 900s. It was a little longer than that, but in the 800s and 900s, there were many unusually deep teachers that came forth in the midst of an era of chaos in China. And that's something to keep in mind, because when things get rough and we can't count on anything, safety, food, support, then we're forced into other resources. And this is part of the point of this koan. So a monk asked Tungshan, how do you avoid or how do we escape heat and cold? And Tungshan says, you go where there is no heat or cold. And the monk, of course, said, well, where's that? Is there any place on earth that has no heat or cold? And Tungshan says, when cold, let the cold kill you. When hot, let the heat kill you. So what does that really mean? And let's give some examples of this too. Hakuin was quite upset in his earlier monk years on hearing the story of Ganto, who's known as Yantu in China. It was a very, very famous monk and eventually a teacher, and had his own temple. And at one point, the place was overrun with bandits, as you have heard in the past, and all the other monks ran away, but he stayed, and they skewered him and killed him. And as he was being killed, he let out such a scream that it was heard for 3 leagues, which is 9 miles. When Hakuin heard that, he was devastated because he had become a monk in order to become free of entering hell. He was sure as a kid that he was destined for hell. And one of the talks, the Blood and Thunder talks, his mother took him to when he was a kid, kind of underscored the importance of trying to avoid hell, because the talk expressed all the different kinds of hells, the sword tree hell, the cold hell, the hot hells, the boiling oil hells, when you are dumped in boiling oil, and a few other things. I mean, we don't need to use our imaginations just to know that it was actually quite intense. And for a young Hakuin, it was quite intense as well. There are 3 places in the world these days, although I don't know if it's still extant in Hong Kong, but where a Burmese businessman, I believe he was the founder of Tiger Balm, had used his money to forward Buddhism in Asia. And as a result, he had created in Rangoon, also known as Yangon these days, and in Singapore and in Hong Kong, what are known as the gardens. And in each of these gardens is depicted life-size or 3/4 size, or I think that was mainly it, particularly in the Singapore one, which is quite widespread and has many, many little expressions, models, and you can walk through the ice cave hell. You can see people being skewered on the sword tree hell, and so on and so forth. There's any number of hells in that way of looking at things. And the same is true of Hong Kong, although the one in Hong Kong is considerably smaller and on different platforms. I never did get to the one in Yangon, although I live there. But at any rate, young Hakuin was given a long dialogue of descriptions of these hells, and he was sure he was going to fall into hell. And so when he heard that Ganto had screamed when he was skewered, it just pulled the wind out of his sails, and he became quite depressed, and eventually, as a result of that, quit Zen practice, although only temporarily. So to really understand Ganto, you need to put yourself in his place. Now, if Ganto was truly enlightened, and he was, then what was that scream about? People have this idea that when you have an awakening experience, particularly as you go deeper and deeper, that you are totally free, and that means you don't have to worry about suffering. You don't have to worry about fear. You don't have to worry about anything. And yet here Ganto was screaming. In order to solve this koan, you need to go where hot and cold kill you, where Ganto is skewered, where any number of other things that are challenging and painful take place. And I don't think we have to go there. We find them in our daily lives most of the time. They range from little disappointments to great fears and trauma. And so what was it about Ganto's scream? And how do you go beyond heat and cold? How do you go to the place where there is no heat and cold? You have heard many times of tuning in to our body and feeling exactly what the sensations feel like. You don't go into the idea of things. You simply become one with whatever is there in that time. And that is exactly what Ganto did. Now, when Roshi Keplo was at Hoshinji, he had gone there, a middle-aged businessman with no real physical conditioning. And of course, in America, we sit on chairs. And back then in Japan, they sit on the floor growing up in a kneeling position, or they sit what we used to call tailor fashion. And so they're quite stretched out in their legs. And it's quite traditional, or was back then, that when you enter a zendo and you're accepted into the zendo itself, as opposed to the gaitan, which is the outside tan, where newcomers sit first until they're admitted to the zendo, which can take some time, by the way, then you have two choices, at least back then, and even now, really. You have two choices. You can either sit cross-legged, or you can sit in what is known as seiza, which is sitting on your knees. Of course, there are what are known as seiza benches, so you can have support under your rear end. And here in Mountain Gate, you can also sit, because we sit facing into the room, you can sit as if you're sitting in a chair. The tans are high enough that you can do that. And it's okay to do that. But back in Japan in those days, and also in Japan now, if you're in the zendo, you sit in one of those cross-legged or kneeling positions. There is no alternative. If you need to sit in a chair, you're put on the gaitan. And so that was what Keplo Roshi was faced with, trying to sit not just cross-legged, but in full lotus. And he was in extreme pain. He made it through the sesshin, although he fainted on the last night from the pain, but he stuck it out, which is fortunate for us. And stayed at Hoshinji for several more years before he became so debilitated from lack of nutrition. It was immediately post-war in Japan, and nobody had anything to eat. That it was suggested by his teacher, Harada Dayun Sokaku Roshi, that he move out and where he could actually earn a living teaching English, and at the same time go to sesshin with Yasutani Roshi and continue his Zen practice. And so that's what he did. He was in Japan for 13 years, training full-time, basically. So I remember him telling me, because the summers in Japan are extremely hot and extremely damp. It's an island, a series of islands, and I have actually seen whole trees wilt in the heat. One time I had to go into town, and it's a bit of a bicycle ride. So I'm riding into town, and I'm thinking, good grief, it's hot. Well, when I get back, I found out it was 105 degrees. So he said that when it was hot, as they passed each other in the hallways, for example, the monks would say to each other, including to him, "Atsui desu ne." It's hot, isn't it? And he would think to himself, yes, damn it, it's hot. And many times he was on the verge of leaving. He told me once that he actually got his suitcase all the way to the front gate of the temple, and he added, before he came to his senses, and turned around and went back in and stayed longer. He was going to wear heat and cold. We're not going to kill him. Now, that said, how do we do that? When Ganto was skewered, there was no escaping that. He couldn't dissociate. It happened so fast and was so thorough that all he could do was become totally one with it. And totally one with it included a loud scream. Hakuin totally misunderstood that scream, assuming that that Ganto was in deep anguish. But the reality is that Ganto was so one with the being skewered that there was no room for anguish. There was no room for fear. There was no room for any of the other things we would associate with that experience. He was free. One way most people choose to escape is through dissociation. And to be sure, if we've experienced trauma, that's actually, in the beginning, at least, a healthy response. It keeps us from going crazy. But eventually it becomes a hindrance, because we learn to dissociate when anything difficult, painful is happening, when there's anything we don't like, when we don't want to feel certain feelings, and so on. And that makes us live in a kind of a cocoon of grays, blacks and whites, maybe not even blacks and whites. Whereas we can live in a world of technicolor, full sound surround, deep fulfillment, and freedom, even in the midst of these kinds of challenges. So how do we do that? Exactly the way Tongshan was teaching, to become so completely one with the experience of whatever it is you don't want to feel, versus trying not to feel it. In other words, you go right into your body and feel that wretched feeling, or that terror, or that fear. And if it's intense, and you get right to the edge of where it's going to be way too difficult to manage it, then you back out for a bit. Next time it comes up, you go into it again and feel it as fully as you can in your body. And again, if there's been trauma, it's important also to work with a trauma therapist, because they can give additional guidance. There's a certain overlap in Zen practice between psychotherapy and Zen practice, but it's kind of a gray area. And with something as difficult as trauma, it's helpful to have an outside trained trauma therapist to help mitigate that. Again and again, we go into that felt sense, as Eugene Gendlin wrote about in his very important book in the early 1980s. He called it the felt sense. And it is a felt sense. It's not a thought about sense. It's a felt sense. And that's important differentiation. When we learn to tune in to whatever is going on, no matter how mild or how difficult, by feeling the energy in our body, we open to an innate freedom, so that even when it's going on, we're not caught by it, and we're not compelled to react to it. There's so much going on. Recently, there was another shooting in a bank in, I think it was Memphis, but I'm not sure. And this time, 5 people were killed and 4 others were injured. There have been more gun killings this year than ever before in these few months. We're barely into April. Why? Because people get angry, and instead of tuning into the sense of rage that is working its way through the body, they decide they just grab a gun and start shooting. And whether it is to people whom they consider have caused them pain or not, they just start shooting. The shooting of people in the parade, a holiday parade in a suburb of Chicago, not so long ago, is an example of that. The woman that went into the Christian school, grade school, where she actually had gone herself, and she had 2 AR-15s and mowed down 3 kids and some other folks. If you look at the scale of children's dying in the United States, suddenly it has ramped way up because people have not learned how to deal with difficult feelings, difficult emotions. Some of this, of course, is because people are mentally ill, but not by any means all of it. It's just if there's a gun and we get into a rage, we grab it and start shooting because we don't understand how to work with the rage. When you really tune into anger, it becomes like electricity soaring through your body. And it's quite exhilarating. And when you get to it at that point, you're not caught by it. The same for other sensations that mean other emotions. And this is not something that Eugene Genlin discovered. It was actually something that a 10th century Tibetan Buddhist master Longchenpa spoke about as well. In the same way, he said, whatever comes up, tune in. At the very first moment, it starts to appear before you've tried to escape. In the second moment, look nakedly at that mindset, or that body set, really, because it's not about being in your head. And when you tune in fully, then it is freed. Right in the middle of that emotion, you are free to respond, and your mind is not shut down, so you respond in the most optimal ways. This is a challenge for Zen practice, because as we do our Zen practice, things begin to be revealed. Places where we are caught, places where we've had bad experiences that have conditioned us to be guarded or anticipate things that may or may not come about. And it's important to work with these if we are going to truly be free. And truly free we can become. In my own life, it's been a long process, but it is very different now than when I started Zen practice at age 32. Everyone can do this if the persistence is there, if the willingness to go into the rough part is there, and if the willingness to persevere over many, many years. It took me many, many years to reach this point in my life. And depending on how much is going on in our history and how caught we are in it, it's important to be patient and do this work so that you can become free. We have people here in the Zen who have done a great deal of psychological work and a great deal of Zen practice So if something has gone on in your life that is causing painful or difficult or frightening emotions, then use this method. It is dynamite. It's also part of the exploration into who we are really. Because we cannot go deep in our practice without addressing these caught places, as a dear friend of mine calls them. It is up to each one of us to take heart in this, because it is effective. It's tremendously effective when we get a hang of it. But to learn how to use the felt sense takes time. To get the courage up to walk into difficult feelings takes time, including and especially anger or rage, but also pain, terror, discomfort of all kinds. We sit here in the Zendo for long hours. It's beginning to warm up. We're not always able to keep the windows open. And so there is going to be some level of discomfort. And walk into it, feel it. Use that experience to become free of the small things. And then the big things will follow, and you can become free of those. This is all part of our practice. And it's also part of what is known as the long maturation, wherein we translate, we understand increasingly deep who and what we are. Initially, just a vague thought, a vague experience, not knowing what to feel, where to go. But as we get practiced in it, we begin to realize through experience that this works, and that not only does our Zen practice go deeper, but also our life is more free, and free in a truly free way, not in a denial, not in escape, but in walking fully into our life and embracing it truly. This is the only way to freedom. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.